I served on a Cold War submarine for 3 patrol cycles. The boat was a gray, humming thing that smelled like diesel, sweat, and the metal tang of old pipes. It was the sort of place where every scrape and cough had a meaning, and where you learned faster than you could explain that some instructions are not suggestions, they are survival. Early on, one order engraved itself into the way we moved and ate and breathed. Do not use Tube 6. When they first told me, I thought it was a practical joke. The captain, a man whose face looked like a map of the North Atlantic, said it quietly in the passageway, like he was passing along the weather report. Tube 6 is offline, he said. Engineering's put a lock on it. Don't touch it. That was it. No briefing, no engineering bulletin for the crew. It was as if the number itself had acquired a danger. Everything on a submarine has a number and a place and a procedure. Torpedo tubes are not mysterious black boxes. They are predictable, brutal machines. A loaded cradle, a set of breech doors, a charge of high-pressure air, and valves you pull like levers when it's time. The impulse mechanism that throws a torpedo from barrel to water is tied into the ship's high-pressure air system, an engineered mechanical kindness that becomes a thunderclap if something goes wrong. The manuals show charts, gaskets, seals, and diagrams. The diagrams are organized, soothing, and if you study them, you can feel yourself becoming a technician with calloused thumbs and an easy relationship with danger. If you want the technical shorthand, look at how the impulse tank and air valves are described in standard fleet submarine manuals. Torpedo tube operation is an impulse air business, very specific in the plumbing and safety sequence. But sailors are also story eaters. If an instruction is terse, do not use Tube 6. It fills the empty spaces around it with explanations that grow like mold in a locker. Theories metastasized fast, a jammed door that would not seal, a torpedo wiring anomaly, a live torpedo that had once glitched in the tube and had to be jettisoned at sea, an experiment nobody on board was permitted to know about. There was one rumor that stuck longer than the rest, that shipyards and boards in the Navy's quieter rooms sometimes red flag a position after something happens that can't be confessed in a safety memo. Men whispered the name Scorpion the way you whisper a thunderstorm. Not a certainty, just a sort of omen. The loss of the USS Scorpion in 1968 has a long list of suggested causes. Some investigators and writers later argued that torpedo problems were part of the array of possible explanations. Whether that was true, exaggerated, or dangerous to say out loud, it mattered. The memory of Scorpion made you treat the torpedo room with more courtesy than you treated your own digestive tract. See investigations and reporting that discuss the theories around internal torpedo explosions and torpedo accidents as one strand of the analysis. The boat I was on had 6 bow tubes, that is, 6 holes in the bow behind the muzzle doors where things could be placed and then pushed into the sea. Many boats of our era carried multiple bow tubes, arranged in banks, and the standard design details, why a boat might have 6 tubes, how they are arrayed, are not fandom, they are engineering. If you trace back to the old fleet documents, you'll see the layouts and why certain hull numbers had certain tube counts. For example, the typical bow bank geometry and the way tubes are stacked and numbered in earlier fleet types. The numbering systems themselves are a small code, starboard typically odd, port even, lower numbers at the top. So sailors know instantly where to stand. Torpedo room folklore even extends to how you call a tube by shorthand. Starboard numbers odd, port even. It's a small, comforting geometry aboard a machine that prefers order. Yet Tube 6 was different, even in the way people said it. Tube 6. The spoken digits slowed, as if they were trying not to stir something that might listen. Someone on my watch once painted a line around that muzzle door with chalk and dared anyone to touch it. Nobody did. The engineering crews had chained the breach in a way that looked official and permanent. There were paper tags that read, "Do not operate, safety lock," clipped to the handles. The tags were bureaucratic clean, the kind of thing you can pin down and yet still be told nothing about.
The silence around the tube grew teeth when you began to notice the small things. Maintenance logs had entries redacted with an official stamp. The techs from shipyard days would come aboard once a long cruise and stand near the tube, their hands folded in the pattern of men who had seen things and folded those things away. They spoke low, their language clipped. When the captain's eyes caught yours after one of those visits, you'd see him measure something in the boat's interior, not the machinery, but a human reaction. He walked the passageways like a man on a ledge. We learned the rules of silence quickly. On most patrols, the Navy orders silent running as a tactic to evade passive sonar. You cut non-essential machinery, the crew talks in whispers, you reduce speed to a band where cavitation is minimal, you make yourself less of a signature. It's older than the Cold War, but the Cold War made it ritual. Run quiet, be a shadow, do not be a song. The doctrine is technical and harsh. It stresses that the human body must be a list of movements that make the least possible noise. We did it often. We learned to breathe in the gaps. If you need a primer on the concept of silent running and how navies have used it for stealth, standard references on submarine operations describe it precisely. Shutdown of non-essential systems, low speed to avoid propeller cavitation, and crew discipline. It is ordinary to be told to preserve silence, and it is ordinary to be told to avoid a particular piece of gear. What is not ordinary is to have those instructions buttressed by a second, quieter rule whispered at muster. Some things are left alone for not just technical, but political reasons. The Dept of Navy loves charts and forms, but hates moral panics. An unofficial injunction is usually a way for someone above to move risk around without committing to a paper trail. We were young and liable to test things. That's part of being enlisted men with hands and curiosity. The space between curiosity and survival is thin on a sub. The first time Tube 6 came close to becoming more than a rumor was an ordinary Tuesday in the northern Atlantic when we were running a patrol route in a patch of ocean with a lot of acoustic traffic. The sonar room hummed. Scopes showed the usual forest of echoes. We were under a standing order to run quiet and keep passive detection. The captain, who trusted his watch team, had said nothing about Tube 6 that morning, but the chief engineer, a man named Daniels, whose forearms looked like rail couplings and whose voice was a bank vault, had a look like the weather. He came up to the sonar room hatch and said, not asked, that the torpedo room had a problem with its pump pressure and to keep any soft launches to a minimum. He didn't say which tube. He didn't need to. Later that day, our training schedule required a readiness drill. The point of drills is to keep trouble from surprising you. We would cycle a training torpedo from Tube 1 during drill. The sequence was predictable. Unlock breech, ram the torpedo forward in the cradle, cycle the door, check the impulse tanks, and charge the air manifold. The orders are surgical. When they finally cleared Tube 1, I remember the noise like a physical presence, a purposeful mechanical inhalation, the thump as the torpedo moved, a soft, clean scream of air as the impulse tank blew the dummy waste and the torpedo ejected. After the launch, the torpedo room reported back and the log was clean. It was the kind of small success you've seen 100 times. Machinery obeying men, men obeying checklists. Then the messenger from engineering came down again, quieter than before, and said the drill was to proceed, but no Tube 6. Nobody asked. The drill rolled on in a smaller choreography.
It's remarkable what you can convince yourself of in a metallic world. We accepted the rule without a mutiny, but someone left a note in the torpedo-room log that night, a pencil scratch. Hot run in Tube 6, 1967. It was a fragment. The log entries are like bones. They show you a past that is not a ghost, but a series of actions. A hot run is a phrase that colonizes your brain, a torpedo that begins to run its motor inside the tube where it should not. The consequences are a set of black possibilities. A live run inside a boat is bad in ways that reading a manual will not entirely cover. A torpedo motor going hot inside a tube can strike and detonate within the boat, or it can attempt to leave with its own will. Manuals show valves and vents to handle malfunctions and to vent impulse air, but a hot run is what men tell their children about at night, the day the ship almost broke in two. If you want documentary background on incidents where torpedo malfunctions are part of speculations about submarine losses, there is a long, complex literature that examines scenarios including hot runs and the potential for internal torpedo detonations. The Scorpion investigations returned such hypotheses, among others, in large, contentious reports.
None of us had lived through the original incident, if there was one. But the log's pencil scratch made the atmosphere denser than diesel. A hot run in a bow tube is an engineer's nightmare, not a man-of-war anecdote. The tube is a small cylinder, but its misbehavior can be catastrophic. A live torpedo's gyros are early brains. Once they spin and wake up, they may not accept the fact that the world outside their muzzle is supposed to be not your hull, but the wide sea. The impulse tank and valves are your last protocol. If the torpedo won't obey, they can be your last friend. We walked by Tube 6 with a tenderness we did not show the rest of the boat. There is another thing about torpedo tubes that is quietly technical and also existential. The tubes and their fixtures have been modified through generations of submarines. In time, a tube might be adapted to accept newer weapons or different adapter rings. There are external tubes on older foreign boats and internal bows on modern designs. Some tubes are paired for side-by-side loading. But the practical lesson is that Tube 6 might have been repurposed in some past refit, or it might have been the tube a yard used for a certain experimental weapon. The Navy has a history of testing gear on patrols as well as in the yards. Sometimes that testing becomes classified and then unloved. A tube tied up and tagged often means someone pushed something experimental into a space and then said, privately, "Not on my watch." Historical references on tube counts and typical designs for submarine banks highlight why certain tubes can stand out as different in their configuration and why yard work can change their status. Our collective imagination is lazy and merciless. It will fill emptiness with shapes. For weeks, Tube 6 was the shape that won small bets and long poker games. "Bet you 5 you'll never see the breach open," said one petty officer. "You're on," said the next. The men joked when the captain wasn't listening, the way sailors do, but jokes thinned in the engine room corridor. Daniels, the chief, stopped laughing. He had been aboard earlier boats that had fought fires and plugged leaks and seen pipes that insisted on failing. He had a low tolerance for errors. One evening, he sat me down and said something like a confession. "You don't know the hazard of a live run in a closed space until you've smelled the wiring after. You don't need to know. You need to trust the tag." He tapped the tag on Tube 6 and did not say more. But of course, curiosity is contagious on ships. Men want to understand, because understanding keeps the mind from inventing perils. So one of our petty officers, a fellow who liked being a hero in other people's near misses, got the bright idea of a small experiment. He argued the tube's lockout tag had been on for a decade. Maybe it was a leftover. Maybe some chief engineer had put it on permanent hold after a refit and nobody had updated the paper.
He wondered aloud in the mess if someone could crawl into the tube and clear the breach and see what the fuss was about. God helps those who are not wise. The petty officer had the kind of arrogance that travels in pack psychology on metal boats. He did not set out to run a torpedo. He wanted to check the seals, to pop open the breech doors with a small, supervised mechanical qualification. The plan was stupid and improbable, and thus perfect for a sub's late-night mischief. It was not sanctioned. It involved stealth, and a ladder, and a headlamp, and a pocket of hours the captain would not be awake for. It took 2 nights to plan. The petty officer recruited a quiet crewman as an accomplice, a young lad who wanted to prove his lack of fear, and they crept to the torpedo room at a time when the watch rota meant the engineer was in other systems. I did not sleep that night. I had mixed feelings. A part of me was glad someone might put the matter to rest, but another part of me was raw with foreboding. The petty officer and his accomplice moved like thieves in a cathedral. They broke the seal on Tube 6's tag with a small screwdriver they kept for loose bolts. They opened the breech very slowly, as if the door might cough and tell them a secret. The torpedo cradle was there, empty. The interior smell was an old perfume of machine oil and seawater and fiberglass dust. They inspected the adapters. They shone lights into the dark, saying nothing. What they found was not resolution, but an envelope. Wedged in the cradle and jammed under a cradle roller was a sealed metal envelope like a small ammunition can without the optics. It had a stamped number, a date, and a directive type. The date was older than both of them. The envelope's stamped label had been chewed at the edges, as if teeth or time had worn it. They opened it there in the tube like boys broken by curiosity. Inside was a single paper with cramped handwriting. If this is opened, do not use Tube 6. Await CO and ENMD. That was it. No signature, no protocol, a single line smudged by salt. The petty officer thought it was an old memo. He thought it was a relic and wanted it for the mess as a trophy. They took the envelope back to the petty officer's bunk and laughed and drank and put the thing in his locker as if he'd recovered pirate treasure. 2 days later, during a routine battery test cycle in the engine room, there was a small, localized short in the control manifold attached to the air compressors. We all felt a vibration like someone had slapped the boat across its back. The boat listed a degree and then corrected. Nothing catastrophic, but the kind of micro-event that wakes you up. The captain called engineers and the chief. They checked seals, valves, and the compressed air manifolds. The petty officer was summoned to the captain's cabin and told to open his locker for inspection. He slid out the envelope like a thief in a play and gave the captain a look that begged for his own miracle. The captain held the paper as if it was a small living thing. He did not shout. He did not laugh. He looked at the petty officer and said quietly and finally, "Where did you get this?" The petty officer lied like a child and said he'd found it wedged in the tube. The captain's face folded into a map of gloom. He closed his hand around the envelope until the paper crinkled. The petty officer found the floor uncomfortable to look at for a few days. 2 weeks later, the petty officer was transferred off the boat. Reassignment, the chief said, but the older sailors knew the economy of Navy language. A man who had messed with a chain of command tag unwittingly could be shown the folly of his choice. Sometimes reassignment is mercy. Sometimes it is the Navy's way of protecting men by moving them out of harm's path. After that, the captain sat the watch down in the wardroom and read aloud from a manila binder he pulled from a shelf that had not been opened in years. It was not a formal record. It was something between a captain's log and a private ledger. In it were notations. Tube 6, 1967, hot run. Tag placed by yards. ENMD to inspect when feasible. He looked at the men like a farmer looks at his flock in mud. "We do not use Tube 6, he said. "It is marked for reason. It is not yours to test." That line, "It is not yours to test," became the new protocol. We obeyed because we did not want to be the thing to break the continuity of quiet on the hull. We obeyed because the possible consequences read like myths. A hot run causing a scald of fire in the bow, a torpedo motor surging and striking the hull from within, a boat's structure compromised by an internal detonation. These horrors are real in the limited geometry of a hull with compartments. There is no space to absorb a wrong. The manuals are technical, but sailor's lore is simple. Don't tempt the machine. I do not know whether Tube 6 had once held anything nuclear or exotic. I do not know whether it had housed a test weapon whose wiring had been unreliable. What I know is that the envelope and the tag and the captain's look were enough to keep hands off. The Navy will sometimes keep secrets even from its own men, for reasons you can guess: politics, plausible deniability, and a prurient fear of panic. Whatever the cause, the boat's mood changed around that tube. Men walked a little quieter past it. The maintenance rounds left the muzzle doors alone. There is another kind of reason for a taboo: the psychological ecology of a ship. A crew that believes a place is forbidden will, by ritual, protect it. The superstition keeps curiosity at bay, and curiosity, if not very carefully audited, tends to end in accidents. Savvy captains understand the power of taboo. A tag is thin paper, but can be a wall as sturdy as the steel bulkhead. In the Cold War, that kind of governance mattered as much as any grommet. Time on a sub is long enough that a small prohibition becomes architecture. We made Tube 6 part of the boat's furniture. The figure of "do not use" had shape and muscle memory. When we re-entered yards, when men from shipyards came aboard and peered into the torpedo room, they respected the tag as though it had the force of law. One yard chief slid a hand along the tag and smiled with an exhausted humility and said, "Some things have to be left alone for the sake of a boat." He had seen men tempted by things like logbooks and brass plaques, and had watched curiosity swallow careers. The most consequential morning came when we were tasked, reluctantly, quietly, to shadow a convoy suspected to be tailed by a lonely, hostile hunter-killer. The tension on board snapped wires and wrote tight lines on faces. Sonar had picked up a shape somewhere off our stern. Orders from command were simple: keep contact, shadow, maintain stealth. If the hunter found us, we would not survive a fight in that choke. The captain and XO planned on non-violent evasion and on stealth to confuse the hunter. Our job was to be a ghost. At 300 hours, we made a maneuver to check a bearing, and one of our watches observed a strong, anomalous knock in the bow. It was a sound like a metal hand running along ribs, a small vibration, barely detectable, but present. It was the kind of acoustic signature men who live in echo chambers learn to fear. You file it in the brain beneath structural movement and then watch it like a hawk. The engineer went to look and reported that a seal on Tube 6 had a micro pressure loss on the indicator, a trivial leak, they said. They sealed it and put a repair on the docket for the next yard. Men gripped the rails with the steady hands of the practiced. We made it through the engagement with our skin intact. But that evening, the petty officer whose locker had once held the envelope came up to me in the mess with the attitude of a man who has been close to something and wants to show you. He slid a folded piece of paper across the table. On it was a notation, a yard scribble about a replacement part, a weird battery insertion, and an odd sentence: Tube 6 not to be used with active propulsion until E&MD clearance. It was the kind of bureaucratic residue that smells of a larger agency at work. Eventually, we left that patrol and rotated out. I remember the torpedo room smell as a small grief step: oil, wet metal, the tang of copper wire. We steamed into a yard where the boat would be checked. Men joked about whether Tube 6 would be opened at the dockside, whether the envelope would be found and explained. The yard workers were polite and private. On the day they came aboard to inspection, the chief engineer from the yard, a man who smelled of diesel and machine oil, walked straight to Tube 6 and touched the tag like a blessing. The briefing I was finally given was not a brief at all. It was a sealed document that I read in a small office where they put you to know the truth and then not speak of it. It said that years ago, in a different political climate, a torpedo in Tube 6 had experienced a hot battery, a chemistry failure in a wartime battery pack assigned to a prototype torpedo, leading to an uncommanded activation inside the barrel that was stopped by a last-minute internal safety interlock. The interlock had performed correctly, but the incident was terrifying enough that the yards placed the tube on a safety hold while the torpedo's battery chemistry was redesigned. The paper had official stamps. It had diagrams that matched what we'd seen in the manuals. It read like a history of near misses. There are documented incidents and engineering analyses that look at torpedo battery failures and inner tube malfunctions as possible causes of accidents. Attentive readers and researchers will find analyses that point to speculative links between torpedo glitches and catastrophic submarine events. That literature is complex and contested.
The document did not mention nuclear devices, nor did it suggest anything cinematic. It was a quiet, mechanical terror. Battery cells overheating, a torpedo motor turning, a tube with closed doors and the geometry of a kettle. The remedy had been technological. Redesign the power packs, add redundant interlocks, and tag any tube that had once seen that fault until the new design could be rolled out. The policy made sense. The policy also contained a human decision. Some risks you eliminate by cleaning the part. Others you eliminate by forbidding use until the system is demonstrably safe. The second is easier to enforce in a world of uncertain chemistry and politics. I remember thinking then, in the small office with the sealed papers, that Tube 6 had been a teacher by silence. We had learned to obey a tag not because it was our only option, but because the tag had saved us. Men who had seen an engineering failure had made a decision to cordon that violence with paper and chain. We were saved by a bureaucracy that sometimes remembers to err on the side of caution. Years later, men still ask me if Tube 6 really had a torpedo that almost ran hotter than the sea. I answer that the truth is half engineering and half the human inability to comfortably face risk without ritual. There are technical explanations, the interplay of torpedo design, battery chemistry, impulse tank pressures, and fail-safes. There are also narratives, the way sailors create stories, the way captains protect crews by keeping some things tucked away. Our doctrine of silent running meant we trusted our machines to make less noise, and we trusted our tags and signs to keep us from making the kind of noise that kills. In the end, Tube 6 remained unopened on that boat throughout my deployment because the men in charge preferred the quiet dignity of caution to the glory of a solved puzzle. If I had to sum up the lesson, it would be this. On a ship, you do not always need to know all the reasons for the orders you obey. Sometimes obedience is a form of care. Sometimes a chain around a breach is the difference between a long patrol and a last patrol. When I scrapped the boat years later and walked her deck for the last time, I ran my hand along the muzzle of Tube 6 as if saying farewell to an old friend. The tag was still there, frayed at the edge and stubborn as a prayer. It felt like an old man's hand when I touched it. The tag had followed the boat through decades of quiet and the occasional thunder. I tucked my fingers under the edge and remembered the breath of a diesel engine at dawn, the smell of torpedo oil,
the pencil scratch note in the log. We are a species of small rituals and larger consequences. We learned that some machines are best treated like the weather. Measure them, respect them, and sometimes, when there is a small, scarred place under the hull, do not poke it. If you ever serve on a boat and you hear that a system is to be avoided, respect the warning. A tag is more than bureaucracy. It is an artifact of memory. Tube 6 taught us that. The wisdom of the hull is not always written in the manuals. Sometimes it is written in tape, tags, the hush between standing orders. In Cold War seas, where secrets and silence double as armor, a small instruction like "do not use tube 6" can be the human artifact that keeps a crew alive.